mode. Now, these images of the Celts are very much a part of our popular culture, and I'm guessing you didn't have a whole lot of trouble coming up with this kind of image. They're shown in movies, you see them in books, on TV. There are a million websites that you can look at in any place pretty much where people share information. Now, in this course, what I'm interested in talking about is what we know about the actual Celts, the real Celts, where these images come from, how we should think about the ancient Celts, which parts of the image are accurate and which aren't, and if they're not, why we think about them that way. We're going to talk a lot about history, which usually means written documents. We're also going to talk about archaeology, which looks more at physical remains, at things people leave behind, at the remains of actual people themselves, and so on. We'll also use a little bit of linguistics. We won't go too heavily into it, but it's an important part of the whole story of the Celts. A little bit of anthropology, and pretty much anything else that I can think of that would be relevant. Now, the main question we want to look at is, who were the Celts? We want to start by looking at that. Now, I'm an archaeologist. I work in Ireland, so my inclination initially in talking about the Celts is to give an archaeological answer. The archaeological answer would be that they were a group of people. They lived in Europe during the later part of the Iron Age, and we'll talk about all these specifics later on. Now, the Iron Age is defined on the basis of the use of iron, hence the name. Iron was used for tools and weapons, but it's only really used as a convenient label. The production of iron didn't really do anything important for people per se, and we'll talk more about that later too. But it was something that archaeologists could recognize. When we find iron, we know we're looking at an Iron Age site. As a whole in Europe, the Iron Age begins around 800 BCE. Or BC. People use different kinds of dating systems. The more modern version is to use BCE and CE instead of AD. Now, the exact timing varies a little bit depending on whether you're in Europe or Britain or Ireland, because the beginning of the use of iron, the production of iron, depended upon where people were, when they learned about it, and so on. It ends with the Roman conquest, which also was not a single event, but rather a series of events, which varies from place to place to place to place. The earliest in Europe, in terms of the Roman conquest, was about the 3rd century BCE. So that's sort of the 200s, okay, in terms of chronology. At its latest, it ends sometime in the 1st century CE, okay, so that's the first 100 or so years after the 0 year, which didn't really exist, but we don't want to get into that. In Ireland and in parts of Scotland, Rome never actually conquered. They were probably in contact through trade and so on, but Ireland and large portions of Scotland were never part of the Roman Empire in any formal sense. So there we talk about the Iron Age ending with the conversion to Christianity, which in both of those places happened in the 5th century CE. Traditionally in Ireland, it was 432 with the coming of Patrick and so on. So if you ask the question, who were the Celts in archaeological terms, they were a group of people who lived in Europe during the later part of the Iron Age, between around 800 BC and somewhere between the 3rd century BC and the 5th century CE. But that doesn't really match the answer that would have been given when these people we're calling Celts were actually running around and living their lives and so on. We don't really know what they would have said if we had started talking about them as Celts and so on, because it's certain that they saw themselves much differently than we see them now. So where does this idea that we have of the Celts come from? Now, in a literal sense, archaeology doesn't really identify the Celts. The Celts is a name. And archaeology can't really identify names unless it's actually written on something, okay? Archaeologists talk about the Iron Age, a time period, as opposed to the Celts, which is a whole sort of slightly different thing. Technically, Celt is a name recorded in historical documents, okay? And we begin to see this name appearing for various groups.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.